Kyle J. Olson. He's a lecturer in archaeology in the Department of Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. And he'll be presenting tonight outsider perspectives on the archaeology of the American bottom. And rather than try and explain that, I'll let him do that. So, thank you.
All right, thank you, Bill. Thanks for being here tonight, everybody, and thank you to Jane Sedona for setting this up. I've been meaning to come over and get to meet you guys for some time now, but as you know, one thing or another gets in the way. Yeah, this is hopefully the first of many conversations that we can have about the incredible archaeological resources that we have just here, and the perspective that me as I call myself an outsider, but outsider, insider, insider, outsider, well, I guess you guys will be the judge of that by the end. But in any case, what I want to talk to you guys tonight about, on the one hand, is who I am, where I come from, my experiences teaching archaeology, and specifically the archaeology of St. Louis at WashU, as well as something kind of interesting that came up in the past couple of years in the way that Cahokia and the things that happen with Mississippian culture fit into these sort of larger narratives that are circulating within archaeological discourse, but also more broadly as well, in popular books about archaeology that have been written for a more general audience, as well as some ideas for potential collaboration with the society, potentially down the road. So I may set this down.
All right. Here, I'm going to have you switch mics. I think there's
Switch
something
mics.
going on here.
Uh-oh.
Sorry, they can't hear you.
It's okay. Which mic do we need to switch?
A small one. I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
Hopefully that's better.
Okay. Testing.
Now let us know.
They'll let us know.
Yes, they let us know.
Great. Okay, so my name's Kyle Olson. I've met some of you before, but for those of you who don't know me, I have an archaeological background that spans the eastern part of the United States as well as Europe and large parts of the Middle East. I did my undergraduate degree at Ohio State University and my graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. I also did my postdoctoral research in Istanbul, Turkey. That was a couple of years back, and I had lots and lots of detours over the course of my career, but includes study abroad in Russia and Tajikistan, as well as field projects in Hungary, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, 2 separate projects in Oman, field work back home where I grew up, as well as notably in the Mississippi Valley here. Let's see, where am I at my slides? We'll come back to that in a moment. But in any case, the areas of archaeology that I am trained in, and dare I say, an expert, for what that's worth, include things like the archaeology of visual culture and the visual culture of archaeology. I originally wrote about anthropomorphic figurines. I wrote about semiotic theory in archaeology, and more recently I've been writing about the archaeological mode in contemporary art. But I also wrote my dissertation about digital methods for reusing legacy data. So I did a lot of work to recuperate old site gazetteers as well as museum collections and to bring them into an integrative digital environment upon which I could perform a number of different kinds of analyses, including settlement pattern analysis as well as satellite imagery, remote site prospection, a number of different more sort of quantitative and traditional kinds of archaeological research. Nowadays, I also focus a lot on the historical political economy of archaeological fieldwork. This has been a big part of my research for the last couple of years. And also one of the things that is most fascinating to me about the American bottom archaeology is a very complex social history of how we know what we know about Cahokia. And then, of course, my areas of focus, I wrote my dissertation about Iran. I did a lot of fieldwork in Central Asia as well as in Turkey, and now increasingly here in the Mississippi Valley. Just a little bit about what my actual technical background is. I mentioned site gazetteers. This is what they used to look like way back in the day. This is from 1930. And at that time, and what I'm writing my book about right now, it has to do with how exactly it was that so many American archaeologists ended up doing fieldwork in the Middle East. Under what conditions, for what reasons, to what ends, how did they determine where the stuff went and who was stewarding it, questions like these. So this involved digitization of a bunch of paper maps and transforming them into digital formats, using a variety of different GIS softwares, creating relational databases, doing site resurvey using Google Earth imagery. And I was pretty successful actually in relocating. I had a 75% success rate in relocating archaeological sites just using the satellite imagery. Fortunately, in this particular region, the archaeological sites are tells, and it's an agricultural landscape, so they have that classic sort of truncated cone shape, and there's usually not agriculture on top of them, so they really stick out in the landscape. But that said, pretty remarkable that given the pace of development and various other taphonomic processes, that the archaeological record as reported in the 30s is still mostly intact, which is kind of incredible. And I put this image up here as kind of a little bit of a trick, but could people guess which side is which? Northeastern Iran, where I wrote my dissertation, and the other Central Ohio, where I grew up. What's that?
Iran, what?
Ohio. Yeah, so John knew though. Yeah, so this is the thing. I often like to joke that this region of Iran that I wrote about, the very far northeastern corner next to the Caspian Sea here, it's basically the closest thing that the Middle East has to Ohio. And I also joke that Hungary is like the Ohio of Europe, which is the first place that I did field work. Anyways, I become, increasingly, I suppose I bring all this up to say that I spent a lot of time thinking about mounds. Mounds of various different sorts. I mean, specifically, grew up in Central Ohio here, where the heart of mound country, not too far away from Hopewell Mounds, Newark Earthworks, etc. As well, and then also these, Middle East mounds are settlement mounds. They're quite different. They're not geometric earthworks. They're not burial mounds. They're not these sorts of things. Very, very different, but nevertheless very important to that tradition of research as well. I may skip over this a little bit, but as I have become more interested in more recent time periods as an archaeological subject to study, I've become very interested in the history of the specific place where I grew up. This is my hometown, this is my mom's hometown, and it lies exactly on the line of the Treaty of Greenville, which ended the Northwest Indian War shortly after the American Revolution. And is notable for a number of different things, but most important among them is inaugurating the practice of annuities, as well as the very first reservations, which that is something that I was 36 years old before I learned that there were, not only were there reservations in Ohio, but they were the first reservations. So there's some interesting stuff going on. I'm also bringing that sort of attention to this region as well as part of my teaching and my ongoing research. And additionally, this is where the insider-outsider thing comes, because that's me in 2011 digging at Rattlesnake Mound. So I did my field school with Tim Hocketat. That was the year of what I believe they call the Mississippi Initiative, the big religion-oriented project. Maybe some of you remember his graduate students, Sarah Byers and Melissa Baltus, who were the PIs of that particular project. And we dug a step trench in and cleared out the backfill from Moorhead's excavation. And honestly, I was an undergraduate, so basically I was learning how to use a shovel and dig a nice clean trench, which was, basically 2/3 of the way down here, not cut back, as you can see. I also did a lot of field work in southern Mississippi with Meg Hasselbaum. She was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania while I was a graduate student there. Poles Creek site called the Smith Creek Archaeological Project, and that was the project. I spent 3 summers digging there, so I feel like some woodland period Mississippi mounds, I have some experience, but most of that as a student as opposed to a professor. So the next thing that I want to talk about is some of the things that I have been working through and teaching my students in this course that I teach at WashU called Archaeology in the St. Louis region. So I divide this course into 3 sections. The first section concerns basically the peopling of the Americas until contact. The second section is the period of European colonialism all the way up to the founding, or well, not the founding, but the Louisiana Purchase, basically. So the long 18th century, the period in which the French and the Spanish were the sovereigns in this area. And then the third section is about basically archaeological heritage going back to the 19th century, really kind of starting at the Civil War and then bringing it all the way into the present. But for the purposes of this talk tonight, talking about how it is that I go about trying to teach WashU undergrads, many of whom are not anthropology majors, and who probably, most of whom also are not from St. Louis, so they don't really know that much about the spectacular archaeological heritage that we have here. And so, again, as an outsider, insider, but mostly outsider, trying to figure out what the actual sequence of events has been, I've had to rely on, secondary literature. Of course, also site reports and many other things besides. But one of the things that I think you guys in this room probably don't need to be educated on is that even on something as simple as a chronogram, there are significant differences in the way that this sequence is thought of amongst the Cahokia archaeological community. And I have no stakes in this, so I'm willing to just take it where it is. But the trick is that, it's one thing for me to make sense of it, it's another thing for me to explain what's happening to these undergraduates who have very little background knowledge on the subject. But nevertheless, I think it is important for them to understand the broad sequence of developments and change over time. And so, of course, I talk about the layout of the site as best that I can explain without getting deep into the weeds, like how the actual central precinct came into existence as best I've been able to glean from the different sources. Again, of course, not all of which necessarily agree with each other about the timing and the specific aspects of this. One of the things that I've been really trying to figure out, for me personally, and then also for the purposes of teaching, is to try to make sense of what among these key features that are talked about again and again and again in all these different sources are actually contemporaneous with each other. There's an answer to that question, and I would imagine that some people in the room can help point me in that direction. But it can be sometimes difficult to, and I understand there's very good reasons why this is the case, to be able to say, all right, here's a map of the site during the Loman phase, here's a map of the site during the Sterling phase, and so on. Obviously, not all the maps have been dug or dated, as you know, so that can get to be kind of complicated at times. But there are these, as you guys are all well aware, some of these sort of spectacular case studies that always get the students' attention, right? Mount 72, for example. That's just, it's unbelievable in some respects, right? But for me personally, trying to, make sense of what's actually going on there, as a person who didn't do my graduate training in this literature, I didn't do my, doctoral exams on the American bottom archaeology, so I'm not as close to the sources as I might otherwise be. So I have to kind of look at what different groups of people have said and try to, evaluate truths somewhere in the middle, perhaps. I don't know. I'm open to learning more, of course. And then I do my best to try to explain some of the geomorphological features and recent history, as well as the sort of general landscape palimpsest that is represented by the central precinct, and really trying to emphasize as much as I can, assigning students the latest research that's been published in the most recent time. My personal approach for my own edification would be to do it exactly the opposite and go all the way back to Breckenridge and work my way forward, but the students don't have time for that here. So anyways, then I get into trying to figure out what was Cahokia in order to explain why the students should care, basically, beyond just general historical knowledge. And among those reasons is that part of the framework of the course is to chart these sort of changing over time of the relative peripherality versus centrality of the St. Louis region, looking at those three time periods that I mentioned before as kind of these sort of peaks and valleys of civilizational development, whatever you want to call it. But also, on the other hand, trying to understand, in a sort of broad sense, what are some of the leading theories to explain the emergence, the rise, and the fall of Cahokia, and getting at some of the different arguments that have been made, for example, by our very own John Kelly here, about why did so many people want to be here at Cahokia? We talk about these population estimates and all of the different evidence for in-migration, for cultural mixing, for all of this different kinds of stuff. And as somebody who, again, is trying to not only educate myself about the particulars at a pretty fast clip, but then also be able to synthesize it, condense it, and explain it to a bunch of mostly uninterested 19-year-olds. A real, it takes some doing. But I think there's some really interesting things that we can say about the general sort of layout of the site and some of its, some of the appeal, as we have, the allure, perhaps, we can say. And I think this the sort of the general layout of the site and the various axes and the alignments and all of this different kinds of stuff. Just trying to, I mean, perhaps what is I've been leaving implicit up to this point is that a lot of the way that I think about archaeology tends to be at scale and mesoscale or even macro scale as opposed to the micro scale of an individual excavation. So of course I've been very interested in the sort of the general plan and layout and landscape aspect of Cahokia for my own purposes. And then of course explaining things about like the Rattlesnake Causeway and trying to understand the not only like the actual central precinct of the site, but then the sort of broader landscape, ceremonial landscape, and residential, etc. Of course, including these fabulous examples like this, and trying to work in aspects of the landscape, including things like Woodhenge and the various sequences of things that I can piece together without actually getting into the data. And also drawing a lot on these recent publications in terms of discussions of change over time in domestic architecture, again at a sort of like zoomed out kind of scale, looking at, for example, things like food production and how this city was actually sustained on the basis of the not only maize but also the Eastern Agricultural Complex, which I think we're all familiar with this particular publication. Yes. I also like to talk a lot about craft production. This was an important part of my own dissertation research, so I've been doing my best to educate myself again about the very important industries of the hoe blades, the point production, as well as the Iranian-sized pottery, and getting a sense of change over time, variation within the site, variation between sites within the American Bottom, as well as certain well-documented practices like the consumption of black drink. I also meant to put in a slide there for the ritual use of tobacco. That's going to come back up again later in the sort of last bit of the talk. But also to talk about art history, because as you remember from one of the very earliest slides, that's been sort of a main focus of my research over the years in visual culture, art history, etc. Trying to understand this, the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, as it's sometimes called, or as it used to be called, the Southern Cult. And really just, I mean, this is one of those things where it's like there's so much information, it's so widely dispersed, but also attesting to like the long-term significance of what happened at Cahokia. Not only just that it's this amazing site with a big population that is an important part of our specific heritage landscape here in St. Louis, but at a continental scale, why Cahokia is such an important and consequential topic. So like I said, I like to talk about the kind of regional approach. So I really spent a lot of time trying to, lately I've been trying to understand the East St. Louis aspect of Cahokia as well, but really just to make sure that the students understand that it's not just this central part of the site that gets talked about so much, but also this broader sort of sweep of occupation across the landscape here. And this also part of, very similar to the kind of research that I did in my dissertation. I've been very interested to find some kind of site gazetteer or database of sites in the region, some of which are published in part or in whole. But up to this point, I don't do nearly as much sort of settlement pattern analysis for my own research these days, but I am very interested in again, understanding this sort of this system, even if I'm not going to try to do like formal, spatial modeling or what have you on it, but to appreciate everything that's going on from Emerald Mound all the way, up and down the American Bottom here. And of course to read things like Bill Romaine's very interesting recent article about the astroarchaeological alignments of the St. Louis Mound Group, and also in conjunction with later parts of that course I'm going to be teaching from Patricia Cleary's new book, The Mound City, and to really be talking about a lot with respect to what happened to the Big Mound. And to try to track down it's known where the collections from the Big Mound are, but to try to understand like what that material actually is, because in most of the publications that I've encountered, they just say, it's known that there's a collection from the Big Mound at the Peabody Museum in Harvard. And I like chase the footnotes down, and it's nothing, right? And so it's sort of like, well, presumably we can find out something about this. But and of course, I think many people. I don't know how many people are familiar with Bill Romain's work, but he really goes on a tear in this particular article, examining all the different potential, summer solstice, winter solstice, etc. aspects of this. The arrangement of the central plaza of the mounds in downtown St. Louis. And then, of course, the destruction of the big mound is quite well documented in daguerreotype and other photographs, which is, I think, a pretty remarkable set of records for information about the way that people have continued to live among mounds even long after they were abandoned. And then, of course, as I mentioned, really, really trying to get to grips with this volume. For those of you who know it, there's a lot of information in there, and it can be a bit overwhelming at times. But one of the things that I'm trying to figure out how to do is to use, because we at WashU we have access to the physical copy of the book, but of course ISAS publishes a PDF of it that you can download from online. So I'm really trying to figure out a way to use this as a teaching tool because from my perspective, it's not enough just to teach these kids about archaeological history. I also want them to learn to think like archaeologists and to appreciate the kind of media that archaeologists use to communicate with each other about the results of the research. And so for them to actually get into a primary source record and to really be thinking about the ways that archaeologists build arguments from evidence and then connect that to these bigger themes and anthropological questions and so on and so forth. For me, this is an extremely useful volume to do that. And then, of course, thinking at an even broader landscape scale and teaching about things like the Richland complex, which is something that I've had less time to investigate up to this point, but something I'm very interested in. And then, of course, everybody wants to talk about the boom and bust and/or the collapse and relating what happened to Cahokia to climate change. In particular, this study was all about the relative incidence of sort of dryness and wetness, and trying to tie the palisade construction and ultimately the abandonment of Cahokia to these episodes of droughts between roughly 1150 and 1250. We also have, of course, everybody wants to talk about the palisade, right? I think this is one of the things that really gets the students' attention because they're like, whoa, hold on, okay, now something different is happening. But again, this is one of those things where I'm still at a very early stage in my own personal understanding of the sequence and the significance of the palisade. But of course, it's such an important aspect of, especially the way the site is presented in a variety of different visual media. So, and then of course also, trying to not necessarily adjudicate between, but certainly introduce the students to the competing theories about why Cahokia collapsed, including the sort of the environmental as well as the social aspects of it. My personal sort of background that I'm bringing to this is from the context of working in the Middle East, where Eric Klein has written several books about the Bronze Age collapse after 1177 BC and then after 1177 BC. And his theory basically is that it's polycrisis. It's all of it. It's a concatenation of every single factor basically happening over the course of a couple of generations really is the thing that tends to lead to the disintegration of especially elite culture. And I think that's an important part of trying to understand the nature of what happened to Cahokia. And I hope that the next slide, well, hang on. Okay, I could have added another slide in here too in terms of the things that I'm still personally trying to make sense of. And that is the relative degree of centralization and the sort of, to what extent was Cahokia a hierarchically integrated and organized polity? I think I don't know that there's anybody out there who's saying that it's not hierarchically organized, but I feel like I'm still trying to understand exactly what the nature of this political authority and institutional sovereignty actually looks like. Now, that's not to say that says more about where I'm at in my journey with the literature than I think anything else. But in any case, that is something that there's again trying to balance these sort of different perspectives and tell a coherent story to the students so they don't get lost in the weeds and they remember, a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, content of the class. And then, of course, what happens after Cahokia with the arguments about the vacant quarter, migrations into other parts of the upper southeast and beyond, as well as, of course, the question about the timing of the migrations of the Cahokia peoples, so the Quapaw, the Osage, Omaha Panza, these groups, and their relative, or what's a better way to say it, the extent and nature of their connections to Cahokia. There are, of course, competing theories about when exactly these migrations happened, but certainly one thing we know for sure is that they were in these territories by the time the European explorers arrived, basically. But the key thing that I try to get across to my students is that's only a couple hundred years after Cahokia completely runs out of steam. And in the grand sweep of human history, a couple hundred years isn't that long. It's just a couple of generations. I mean, that's well within the limits of oral history. In any case, so then that brings me into the kind of next period that I talk about, and this is just going to be a real quick run through from the what I do with the rest of this class. So in terms of trying to teach French colonial and Spanish colonial and early American Republican history, I mean, I have to teach these students history, first of all. Like, many of them, despite having, they're supposed to be these elite students at this elite university, and I ask them if they've ever heard of the 7 Years' War, and they look at me like I have two heads. It's like, you guys, okay, it's called the French and Indian War here, but, anyways. So I have to teach them history, which is annoying, but in any case, then I really like to get into a lot of all this, research that's been done over the last generation on French colonial archaeology in the Illinois Valley. Of which there is, again, a sort of mind-boggling amount of primary source material to work with, and that's just from the stuff that's published. So in terms of the gray literature and the things that remain yet to be written up and published, that's going to be an ongoing fascination for me in trying to get to grips with all of that. Because I think when we are working in these historical periods and we have access to technical records, when we combine that with the archaeological investigations, we can really tell some very interesting stories. And yeah, look at, I go through like a lot of this different stuff. And I try to emphasize, especially what's referred to as the new Indian history, this sort of like revisionist movement starting in the 90s and continuing until now. It really emphasizes the fact that the European powers in the Mississippi Valley in the 18th century were not very powerful. Basically, like, it wasn't really until well after the American Republic, it wasn't really until the U.S. military established the arsenal here in St. Louis that any colonial power actually had the upper hand over the native nations of this region. And then, of course, very quickly, everybody knows the story of the Trail of Tears. That was like 1830s, the removal of the 5 civilized tribes from the deep southeast. But native removal started in Missouri way before that. Basically, within 5 years of the U.S. federal government establishing a presence here, they were signing treaties to get people off of their land and out of Missouri. And so that's also a very interesting archaeological story, but not one necessarily related to this slide. So anyways, then bringing us into the 20th century archaeology that I also find very interesting. There's been so much CRM work done in the city of St. Louis, which I learned about from Michael J. Meyer a couple of years back. He came and gave a guest lecture in one of my classes, and I took him to the Kemper Museum afterwards on campus, and they had a big exhibit in which there were all of these massive, blown-up, very high-resolution aerial photographs of the city from different points in time. And we walked around in the gallery, and he would point and say, "Hey, you see this intersection over here? I did a dig there for 3 years." And he just did that for 45 minutes. And I started to realize, I was like, oh, this guy's done 20 years worth of excavations in the city, and none of it is published. Because, it's the federal contracts pay for the excavation, but not for the write-up, right? So, in any case, there are other examples, of course, including the University of Missouri St. Louis excavations at the Scott Joplin House, in Midtown. Very, very interesting results. Of course, also only partially published. This was the state of the house before it was renovated in some recent time. So they have a nice house museum here, and as part of the renovations for redoing the house to make it into a museum, they did a bunch of excavations in the vicinity on the parcel and on the block. There were a lot of abandoned buildings or abandoned lots on the block, so they were able to do that kind of investigation. Still trying to figure out where those collections are. The University of Missouri St. Louis unfortunately merged its anthropology department with its history department a couple of years ago, or rather the anthro department was swallowed. And the status and location of some of the collections is kind of an open question. And that's maybe a broader theme. I'm interested in knowing where the collections are, generally, whether that's about Cahokia or about 18th, 19th century, or even 20th century archaeology. Great, here we go. There's some, some good urban archaeology in the backyard of the Joplin House. Okay, so that brings us to the kind of last big thing that I want to talk about here today. And I might actually need to sit and draw on my presenter's notes, if that's okay. So I'm going to quote a couple of things from this because I want to make sure that I get the language precise. Now, how many people here have come across The Dawn of Everything, have read The Dawn of Everything? A handful.
I've read the Cahokia parts of it.
You read the Cahokia parts of it, yes. So yeah, there's some. They do some interesting things with Cahokia in this book, and among other things, they take a very they take a stance on it as if it is a completely settled question that Cahokia was a budding grain state in the Jim Scott sense. It was well on its way to becoming, on that developmental trajectory that is known from the sort of formative pre-classic, classic, post-classic progression from various different parts of the world. They see it very much as a very hierarchical, centralized polity organized around competing high-status lineage groups. And then the part that I think is perhaps most interesting about what they had to say is the tracing out the centuries-long impact on the social and political organization of the life of the plains and eastern woodlands, native nations at that time and then subsequently. So, what they say in the text is they say, whatever Cahokia represented in the eyes of those under its sway, it seems to have ended up being overwhelmingly and resoundingly rejected by the vast majority of its people. For centuries after its demise, the site where the city once stood, and hundreds of miles of river valleys around it, lay entirely devoid of human habitation. A, quote, vacant quarter, rather like the Forbidden Zone in Pierre Boulez's Planet of the Apes, a place of ruins and bitter memories. Successor kingdoms to Cahokia sprang up to the south, but then likewise crumbled. By the time Europeans arrived on the eastern seaboard of North America, quote-unquote, Mississippian civilization, as it has come to be known, was but a distant memory, and the descendants of Cahokia's subjects and neighbors appear to have reorganized themselves into polis-sized tribal republics in careful ecological balance with their natural environment. What had happened? Were the rulers of Cahokia and other Mississippian cities overthrown by popular uprisings, undermined by mass defection, victims of ecological catastrophe, or more likely, some intricate mix of the three? Archaeology may one day supply more definitive answers, but until such a time, what we can say with some confidence is that the societies encountered by European invaders from the 16th century onwards were the product of centuries of political conflict and self-conscious debate. They were, in many cases, societies in which the ability to engage in self-conscious political debate was itself considered one of the highest human values. Now, where they're going with that is basically trying to trace out and explain several hundred years worth of a gap in their narrative, and to try to connect what happened at Cahokia to things that are known from the ethno-historical record, such as the war between the French and the Natchez Nation in Mississippi, and using the Natchez, or at least connecting the Natchez Nation to the Mississippian culture pattern in the sense that they did have Emerald Mound in Mississippi, gigantic platform mound, and many sort of cultural continuities, such as the Calumet ceremony, or just generally speaking, the ritual use of tobacco smoking, as well as the black drink, things that they are pointing back to and saying that whatever the nature of the connection between Cahokia and places like this, it is interesting that they are still engaging in some of the same kinds of material and social and political practices. And then using that basically to say that these details form part of a cultural background to a political struggle over the role of hereditary leadership and privileged esoteric knowledge. These battles were still being fought into relatively recent times. Consider the nations known in the colonial period as the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes of the American Southeast, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. All of them exemplify this pattern, being governed by communal councils in which all had equal say and operating by a process of consensus finding. Yet, at the same time, all shared traces of the older cultural pattern, including priests, castes, princes, and the various different sort of what they would refer to as these, in the previous slide, high status lineage groups, right? These long continuities across time and space. And where that fits into the bigger picture, and in fact, I was going to quote directly from this, but I think better to just riff. So where they go from there is basically to say that whatever happened at Cahokia, it was so remarkable and so concerning for the leaders and the political life of the mid-continent that if not direct memory of that was kept alive, then certainly the dangers of submitting oneself in society to hereditary and hierarchical leadership is something to be avoided at all costs. And that for hundreds of years across this vast geography, this political discourse became hegemonic in response to the Mississippian pattern, mound centers, and all the concentration of wealth and authority control, whatever you want to call it, in these places. And that by the 18th century, yes, it would come to pass, for example, that various different of the colonial administrators, missionaries, etc., mostly French speakers living in New France in the Great Lakes, would come to encounter individuals like this man, Candiac, who is a known historical individual who was fictionalized in this book by a man by the name of the Baron de la Hontan, who basically wrote this semi-fictional dialogue between himself and this person that he named Adario. And what he basically does in this is that he uses his experience knowing and interacting with this person, Candiac, who was a Wendat statesman and by all accounts from everybody who knew him at the time, an incredibly accomplished orator, politician, philosopher, and he had very particular views on the organization of European society and critiqued them for, among other things, the wealth inequalities, the power of the church, the submission to the king, and basically launched this critique and said, what on earth makes you guys think that you're superior to us? You call us savages, but you're behaving like children. And in any event, so this guy, Baron de la Hontan, he was basically a rich fail son, and he was unsuccessful in doing colonial ventures, so he went back to Europe and wrote this book and basically ventriloquized what he had learned from Candiac and put it into the mouth of this fictional character named Dario. And it was a massive success. It was translated into like 15 languages within a couple of years. It became a stage play. It was this huge phenomenon, and it was also not unique. There were several other imitators and various other sort of derivative works based on this. And the important point for the narrative in the Dawn of Everything is that this encounter between Jesuit missionaries, people like Baron de la Hontan, was a very, very important and key catalyst to the development of Enlightenment ideas. Free-spirited debate on the nature of liberty, on the origins of inequality, on bringing it all the way down to, guess what? Smoking tobacco and drinking caffeinated beverages, sitting in a circle and arguing with each other. What does that sound like, right? So, I mean, the connecting the dots is maybe a little bit of a loose argument, but nevertheless, one of the things that you get out of the Dawn of Everything is this idea that the collapse of Cahokia is so important that in a butterfly effect manner, it spurred the Enlightenment, which is kind of a stretch maybe. But in any case, it's not based on nothing. But I think there may be coloring outside the lines a little bit. But in any event, this is where this is how Cahokia is being talked about in a much broader audience. I mean, this is by far the best-selling book about archaeology that's come out in the last 25 years, if not longer. I mean, this is like V. Gordon Child level literary success. And I taught an entire class on this book. We did an entire semester where we read it chapter by chapter, week by week. And additionally, we also read the reception of the book in newspapers and magazines and academic journals, and charted out this massive sort of cottage industry of conversation around this book that was going on for several years after it came out. And one of the very interesting things about that conversation, very few people in newspapers, magazines, academic periodicals, etc., talk at all about Cahokia in that conversation. They get tripped up on other aspects of the book. They're very concerned about other things, and so I don't know what the landing spot for me there is, but just to bring to y'all's attention that this is the way that Cahokia is being talked about to one of the the broadest audiences of people consuming information about archaeology in recent years, which is sort of it's also one of those things where it's like as a person who knows like Mesopotamian archaeology really well, in the sections of that book where they're talking about Mesopotamian archaeology, I like looked at the footnotes and I was like, these citations are pathetically out of date. So I wonder whether or not something like that happened with their interpretation of Cahokia as well. But nevertheless, anyway, so the last thing that I want to talk about is potentials for collaboration. So one of the big things that is going on right now is that Professor Sarah Beitzel and I at WashU are currently developing a two-course sequence based on collections and exhibits. So this is a practical training course for students. It is our hope that we can not only get students to understand the importance of collections in the discipline of anthropology and archaeology, but also get some experience in doing science communication, visual communication styles, all the different kinds of things that go into doing work in a heritage institution like a museum or an interpretive center like here, with the hope that eventually we might be able to train students well enough that they could actually be effective interns at institutions such as this one. Then also, I teach a course every fall, which John Kelly used to teach, where I have a budget for guest speakers. So I am very interested in having more local archaeologists come and talk for this. So if you're interested in doing that, it does come with an honorarium, and I'd be more than happy to continue that talk. Continued conversation. I didn't bring any business cards, but I'm easy to find. We can talk more about that. And then also, additionally, I am still at a very early stage in developing my understanding of American bottom archaeology. And there are certain things that I am in dire need of, one of which is access to site database. But on the other hand, I need to make sure that my reading lists, which I have a bibliography that's running into the dozens of pages at this point, but it's obviously incomplete, and you guys know better than I do. What the most important and landmark studies are, as well as, again, like I mentioned before, to figure out where the collections are. This is tied very much into not only this course and potential for student labor to contribute to curatorial, ongoing research, etc., but generally to feed into teaching my Archaeology of St. Louis course and improving the Cahokia section on that. This is kind of going to be one of my signature courses that I teach at WashU, so this is a long-term commitment on my part, although this is only the second time out of what will hopefully be at least 10 or more times that I teach this class. And I really want to do a good job, and you guys have a lot more knowledge about this than I do, so any help would be greatly, greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions?
So when you're saying teaching about Cahokia, that's not such a course, it's part of the St. Louis.
Yep. But I might teach you. Yeah. Yes, and that would give me the time to like slow down and really take my teeth into it.
I mean, in some way, one of the courses I did was on Cahokia as a freshman son. And so you have freshmen that have no idea.
Right.
Well, I should get out in.
Yeah.
Not the kind of things that, but it was really great.
Yeah.
And one of the things we did, in order to understand Cahokia, you're never going to convey to them everything that you give them a chance to participate. And one of the things is to think about this landscape, think about these communities, and then what was it like to go from where in St. Louis is to Cahokia?
Right.
I don't think my colleagues say, I don't want to drag you into it, but the ones that focused on East St. Louis, and I haven't read the book, so I can't, so I got to be careful, but they have often focused on this, even in some cases suggesting state notice society. I think that was rejected out of hand at the very beginning, but that's a whole other discussion. But one of the things I did with the students was, what was it like? So they would come over on the metro, meeting down at the station in St. Louis, and we'd walk, follow basically the national road, sponsor road, that was probably given this path, a road visit from there to Cahokia. And then we stop at a Mexican restaurant. But the idea was to get them to, you're seeing all of this, in the case of East, not all of East St. Louis, but, certainly a community that's in disarray in certain respects, and then coming from the city and then coming from here. Yeah. And so it really helped me understand. And it's 6 miles, it's 10 kilometers. And the only other way to do it was with a dugout where I knew, and Larry wasn't available to get us. So, but if we were to try that, it wasn't possible. Yeah. Because we'd have to portage the interstate. So it was dangerous. I don't know how those turkeys make it. Yeah. But anyways, but it's about the same rate of speed. So one of the things Jim and I are looking at, we're not looking at it in depth, is the connectedness of these communities. And what I was getting at that, picking on my colleagues, is they talk about all this being an urban center. Okay, that's fine. The equivalent of it meaning.
But how did it work?
But think of the distance and the time it's taking. It's like us driving up to Springfield. So that's the amount of time that it takes. But now they weren't worried about it. They didn't have to get back to their the horse racing track. So, I mean, the thing is that experiential opportunity. And it was really taking the kids around Cahokia, students around Cahokia. Even though I'd worked here for quite a few years or in the area, that I realized how big it was. I mean, I could see it on a map and knew what it was, but to actually do it, then you begin to realize the size of it. And that doesn't make it a city, but it certainly led me into thinking that this could be something, even though they're building and talking about Cahokia being a city. So it's, I mean, with students in particular, it's a unique opportunity, particularly in this area, because there's so much. You've already realized that how much is out there.
We're slowly getting to grips.
Yeah, and I think that's unfortunate. I haven't read. I've talked to one of the authors, the other ones, deceased, of everything, whatever. The book you were talking about.
Done everything, yeah.
So he came after the SAs in Chicago here and so we had never been able to talk before. So I don't know. I wasn't trying to change his mind to give him a sense of how I looked at it. And so I'm not quite so. When you're talking about the collapse, I don't really like that term. But basically it's really getting into an indigenous perspective. And one of the books I would suggest reading, sort of to look at, is, and you may have already done, is Francis Fletch, Eric Bailey's book on the Olson, because it gives you a sense of how they're organized. And then it gives you an idea of how much is involved. And even if whether this is a state or a city or whatever, any of these communities, whether it's our own ancestral communities, the Romans are very complex, and people are complex, and they're capable of doing lots of very creative things. And this to me is a creative endeavor. And you look at what they designed it. They think of it in terms of a design course. It's amazing at the beginning. And anyways, it's a lot of fun. So take a bit of time.
Any other questions or comments? Answers?
Well, it might seem obvious, but do your students have a relationship with Cahokia Mounts?
Not too many usually.
There's a great opportunity there. I mean, there's a lot of experts in this room that could definitely take them around and visit the site. Give them tours.
John gave us a tour last spring, but only 6 students came.
Was there only 6?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, admittedly, the weather was bad.
You can't make it a graded assignment.
Not all of them have transport.
Well, with the IAAA meeting coming up in April, that may be a good opportunity.
There's tours on Sunday. We'll give you a flyer.
That's a great idea.
And they can come to the actual conference in here.
No, it's I mean, I appreciate the work that you're doing.
Well, I appreciate it. They created the position for you that I now have. I know. We got to get that on the record.
Are you involved in the discussions about I just read in the student life about the new Native American Studies focus in American Culture Studies?
No, I haven't been involved in that, but I recently met Eric Pinto, and I'm trying to build good relationships.
Shut off.
And I'd like to know more about that. Yeah. Who's going to be leading that?
Gosh, I can't even remember. The students were they'd been lobbying for it, and they were happy that it was coming to pass. I guess the director of who is the director of American Culture Studies?
Oh,
No, the American Culture Studies.
They took me on as one of it was a totally different time, but it was good. But it's frustrating that the Native students have come through it, and they've been trying for years.
They have.
And unfortunately, they see everything, the administration sees everything through their eyes. I mean, that's just oversimplification, but it's really just do the damn thing. What's going on?
well, there was an article in the Student Life that I just found about that, so I'll look into it.
Okay.
Which was also written by one of my current students, so I was like, oh.
Yeah, look, John, thank you for doing this. It's great. Great that you're
appreciate
doing
that.
this.
Yeah, thanks again. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Yeah. I realized I should have put my email address on one of the slides. But
What is it?
it's Kyle O at wustl.edu.
One more time.
Kyle O, KYLEO at wustl.edu.
Thank you all
Great.
for attending tonight.
We will hit the finish button.